trying to kind of be creative and bring in those delightful moments. It's like, okay, let's get the fundamentals out of the way. It's like, get the fundamentals done. Now, how do we push on the brand? How do we kind of like, what is the fun moments that we can bring into this?
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into Nodes of Design. To help support our mission spread knowledge, we have a very special guest on today's episode. Let's welcome Iain McConchie, who is an award-winning digital product designer and a design executive whose career started in 2000 working for MTV in London. Entertainment and cultural media have always been a core influence in his design approach, emphasizing on the emotional experiences as an utility of a digital product or a service. He has worked for brands and clients such as Disney, Visa, McLaren F1, Transport for London, News UK, Netflix, and Headspace. Currently, he is the Senior Director of Product Design at chow. In the last decade, he has focused on people management, supporting talented product designers to deliver best-in-class product and services to their intended audiences. As a visual creative, Iain encourages his team to play, remix, and look at things sideways, pushing on brand and using storytelling to create a differentiated product experience while remaining accessible for all. In this episode, Iain had shared great insights on creativity and differential experiences. We spoke on how to bring creativity and differential experiences to any digital product and what is a structure or a framework that one must follow. We also spoke on how designers could strive to bring uniqueness in product experiences while solving business problems, and as creatives, how could one stay focused on the outcome without thinking or stressing too much about metrics and data. In the later part, we spoke on what are the different ways to train oneself to explore beyond typical patterns and how to deliver great fun and interactive product to the end user, where Iain had shared great insights from his experience working at Headspace. In the end, we spoke on how could design managers and leaders shape their team to bring creativity and uniqueness into the product that they are crafting for. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and on every Friday, we release new episodes with different creative leaders from around the world to help you better understand different concepts related to design. So don't forget to tune in into Notes of Design every Friday. With that being said, happy designing everyone. Hi, and welcome to Nodes of Design. It's a pleasure hosting you today on our show.
Hey there. It's great to be here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Iain. So if you could give a brief about yourself to our listeners out there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I've been working in design in some shape or form for about 20 years now. Originally came in graphic design as a kind of what my field of study, and moved into digital design. I kind of was working for companies like MTV in-house, which is one of my first roles, really understanding how to get the fundamentals of web design, how to really figure that out way back in 2000. And from there kind of evolved through different roles, working in a digital agency, making software products for mobile apps, working with loads of different clients. We can maybe talk about some of those later, to where I am now, having worked back in-house for companies like Headspace, working on meditation and mindfulness and how the brand can be infused into the product experience. And then working for Netflix, like understanding entertainment at kind of global scale. And now just starting a new role as this podcast has been recorded at a company called chow, who's looking to support local restaurants and businesses and help them thrive.
Thanks, Iain. So what was your journey into design and how did you start? And what are your tips to the beginners on how to start?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've been doing this a while. So my journey started way, way long ago. I mean, I grew up in the kind of 80s and 90s, and that's a kind of big kind of creative culture moment. There was a lot of kind of, I guess, an explosion in culture. We had lots of kind of, I mean, I just remember the movies of the time, the kind of the Back to the Future, the Indiana Jones, the kind of Ghostbusters, all those kind of movies that were kind of like really great when it came to storytelling, really great when it came to kind of like taking you on a journey, and also very limited. Like those were the only ones that kind of existed. Now there's so many things, there's so many movies, TV shows and things, but back then it was few and far between. And at some point, I don't know where it came from, I was always interested in drawing. I always was doodling, whether that was in class where I wasn't supposed to be doodling or at home. I wouldn't say I was a great artist by any means. I'm really bad at stuff like still life or anything that's detailed, but anything that's kind of abstract, I can do. I actually had a fine art teacher say to me, I wasn't very good at the fine art, but I was very good at sort of technical straight lines and boxes. So I guess that was kind of foretelling my kind of move into kind of digital and product design, where all you do is make rectangles, right? But I did once paint an ice cream truck for a friend of mine, a friend that they had an ice cream truck. They wanted some cartoons on the side. I painted those for them. So I understood kind of visual design very on as well. I think when it started to work from going a very manual process to a digital one was when I started to mess around with computers and I was making mixtapes. So back when you made a cassette tape with music on it and you had all your different tracks, I would make cover art using, I would cut things out of magazines and kind of cut and paste it manually. And then with computers, I was like, oh, I can scan things now and I can digitally manipulate those things and add color and duotone things. And that for me was like, oh, this is really fun. This is cool. I also studied computer science alongside that as well. So I was working with computers. I was working in this kind of creative medium because my parents had said, hey, you need to, this art stuff is really interesting, but make sure you understand how technology works. Make sure you understand all of these things as well, because you don't know, like, is there a role in art and design? Does that exist? I didn't know at the time if there was or not. But it was really good because I learned basic programming, the programming language. So I was learning, understanding logic, as well as being very creative. And then throughout that whole time and being educated and kind of growing up, digital replaced all of those things, all the manual things, and it became a kind of new way of working. But I think the thing that I always held on to, digital feels very rigid to me. It's like it's very kind of like, hey, you're now working in a digital form, so now this is kind of done and dusted. It doesn't have the looseness of, say, a manual drawing or sketching. So I've always held on to sketching. So even though all my process probably today, if I was to work on something and it would be all digital, whether that's Figma, Sketch, whatever it is you're using, I always start with sketches. I always handwrite things. I've got notepads filled with just drawings and sketches and my manual notes, because it's the direct extension from my brain is like my hand, and I can do that and manipulate it really well. As soon as I get a mouse involved, there's a pause somewhere. So, I mean, when I'm thinking about, starting out, it's like try and figure out, what's your kind of go-to kind of loose, like how is it you can kind of connect directly with what's happening in your brain and get it straight onto paper or a digital thing. It's like, how can you it's not about the fidelity, I don't think, when it comes to design. It's really about the creativity and what is coming out of, okay, get an idea down. How quickly can I do it? For some people, it is on paper. For some people, it is on computer. I'm just built as a different way. For me, it's paper. But I think unless you're kind of, willing to kind of then take that to the next step and then show it, I think it kind of can suffer. So, definitely push on things that interest you. If you like to draw, then great, push on that. If you're coming to design completely fresh from a different, engineering like yourself, okay, well, what is it that is drawing you to design? What is it that you can kind of push on? I figured I was going to be an artist, but it turns out, hey, I'm not necessarily an artist, but the design aspect, the kind of creation aspect, I really latched onto. It's always worth having a backup, like other skills that are around that might come in handy in the future. So I didn't know that studying computers would actually come in useful for then doing web design. Oh, look, this basic language, I can now change that to HTML and I can code in JavaScript. That's really helpful. So that enabled me to do things that were really kind of would have taken me longer had I not studied those things earlier, I think. And just being able to kind of like find something for you that is that little spark that really kind of like brings you into design or brings you into it, and just playing around with it. Like, again, I think it's very easy to follow tutorials, but those are very often very dry. Like, what can you do that's kind of going to be inspiring and fun, I think is really key as well.
Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing this wonderful journey with us. So let's begin our episode today with creativity and differential experiences. So oftentimes we see almost all the product experiences are very plain and not so unique. So how could designers strive to bring the uniqueness and solve business problem as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think I don't have a perfect answer for it, because I don't know that there necessarily is a perfect way. Because I think depending on the business that maybe you're working for, or the product that you're kind of designing, it's very difficult to not consider business needs. Like, you have to kind of like, those are the things that are going to make those are the constraints that, that you have to work with. It's like, hey, take something like China as an example, where, I'm still understanding the business needs. I don't know yet how I can start to kind of bring a differentiated experience to that product. But if I then think of Headspace, for me, that was a lot clearer. That was like, hey, here is a product that is at its most basic audio player. You are getting episodes, almost like a kind of audiobook, sequential, day by day. you go through this journey, you're listening to audio. Now, the audio in question is actually more than just regular audio. It's meditation. It's actually helping you. It's like, okay, here's a different way of consuming this kind of audio, this thing. It's going to have a really impact on you. So how can we reflect that in the product? How can we show that it's more than just audio? How can we bring aspects of the brand into the experience as well? And at the time, everything, when so a little bit of context, I worked with Headspace twice, once in 2012 and then again in 2019. In 2012, it was very much an audio player, and they had some branding, but it was very not chaotic. I think that's a dismissive of it, but I think it hadn't found itself yet. It wasn't coherent, and I think what it needed to do was kind of lean into the fact that it was a very simple product experience, and how can you take aspects of its brand personality and use that to convey the intent of the product. So in this case, it was something that you just played. They had a branding element that was their dot. It was actually part of another product logo type. So we simplified it and said, hey, let's just focus on the dot. You open up the product, you press play, and then you begin. Now that seemed very basic, but as we started to kind of build on that, the thoughts around, okay, how is it this could take form? How can you bring the brand into this? It's like, well, the headspace, the dot represents your headspace. It shows it's a kind of form. It's actually something, if you think of your mind and the way that you can, it is very malleable. You can kind of educate it and teach it. How could we represent that in the dot? Like, can that have taken on a form where it feels tactile, where it has a kind of ebb and flow based on how you do it? It's almost like it's breathing. And we start to bring that into the product experience. Again, it's still a player, still doing the business need of like playing audio. It's still very accessible. It's a big dot. But what we're starting to look at now is something that's more than just a regular player. It's starting to take on a new form. And when you can start with that kind of simple, okay, how do we take this simple interaction and not necessarily flip it on its head, but really lean into the brand. So the brand, it was like, hey, this is about headspace. This is about almost kind of changing your composition of your mind to kind of like be more relaxed. And it's about breathing. So bring that into the product where it makes sense. And this wasn't necessarily to differentiate. This was just like a simplification that then lended itself to the brand. And I think we're very lucky in that the brand already was very kind of established. And speaking to the founders, we understood what the brand stood for. So we could push that through into the product experience. And then obviously the product then evolved from that 2013 release. And the branding kind of grew from that as well. And then you had all these characters who are, again, representing the different states of your mind. So it was the dot was what you interacted with, but the characters were representation of where you should be, how you should be thinking. They were educational, and they grew and became very kind of pervasive within the product experience. So it really kind of stemmed from a simplification thing. So how can designers bring that uniqueness while solving business problems, as you stated? It's like you try and find that little differentiator. What is it that your business or your product can do that is not necessarily different? Again, it's still playing audio. Cam existed in the same time. They went in one direction. They were about landscapes and kind of like this more kind of familiar meditation experience. It was it's a peaceful meadow, or it's a kind of scene. We were like, no, this is much more focused. It's more inward. It's about kind of representing you as an individual and your journey and what the path that you would end, not a generic calm screen. So those products differentiated from themselves in that way because they'd gone in different directions, and what they stood for in their brand was different. But if you were to strip down those product experiences, they're fundamentally the same. They're very similar in the way that they work. They're very similar in the way that they present audio. So yeah, how can you differentiate through different intent and different brand purposes is where you need to explore.
Thank you so much, Iain, for sharing those great detailed examples with us. So is there any particular framework or a structure that one must follow to bring these creative and differentiated experiences?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little. I don't think there's necessarily a framework, but I think as you're trying to kind of uncover what is it that this product stands for, I think there is a kind of investigation that you need to do. It's like, how can you uncover those? Can you think of almost like a kind of, is there an emotion that I want the consumer or the user of this product to feel? Like, I want them to be happy. I want them to be thinking about these things. And can you bring that messaging? Because it doesn't necessarily, it's not visual. So it's not just on visuals. Like it's within the messaging. It's within your kind of tone of voice. It's all of those things again, I'm a big, I think I realize more and more that I'm very impacted by brands and what they stand for. And I think that is the differentiation. It's like, okay, we stand for this thing, differentiate us from those things over here. We can compete in the same marketplace. But here are the things that are core to us. So I think that's where you would start, is like understanding your brand or understanding your product and why you would be different. Way before you start thinking about visuals, it's like, if you kind of quantify those things. If I was to tell you a story about the brand, would you be interested? And what were the questions that you would kind of anticipate that person to ask? And only then, once you kind of got those kind of key themes, whether, again, thinking of Headspace, it's like, hey, I think I remember the founders saying they wanted to be the Nike Plus of meditation. So they were not leaning into the kind of the stereotypical meditation world. They wanted to be something that felt scientific. They wanted to be something that felt you can progress and go on a journey. And that's why we started with this idea of a journey line, the fact you would see your progression. It's like, oh, I'm improving over time. So again, those little notes that you find when you're discussing what the brand stands for, those are the things where you go, okay, well, if it means this to kind of go on a journey, then we should lean into that. We should find those things that we can lean into. So understanding your brand is the key thing there. I think you're trying to kind of really figure out as well, can we differentiate through visuals? Can we do that? Does it make sense to? Because I think there comes a point where you can go too far. You can kind of like make things really fun and exciting, and you lose track of actually what you're trying to achieve. I think it's a fine line. I think those brands that do it well have figured out where to kind of get that balance right. I would say Headspace is there. I would say another product that I think when I was at Headspace we'd often refer to as Duolingo. So they have their owl that kind of like guides you along, and that makes sense. It's like, here's a kind of guide. The owl, I think, would be used in many different ways to kind of like motivate you and to kind of like get you excited about learning a language. But again, if you strip that down, it's just giving you some text to translate. It's just testing you those things. But Duolingo has been very successful because of that brand, because of the way that it figures out. I have no idea how they came up with that or why they leaned into having a green owl educating you, but it works, and it helped differentiate them as a product. And I think you always think of the owl when you think of Duolingo. So I think the creative and marketing angle of that's been really successful.
Thanks, Iain. So as a creative, how could we stay focused on the outcome without thinking or stressing too much about some metrics and the data?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would assume for the most part that you're going to be working and collaborating with people who can do that for you. So you will be working with product managers, you will be working with engineers. Maybe you're lucky you have research and data analysts as well. So this is, I think you can kind of go, oh, I need to consider the metrics. And yes, you do, but it should be a collaborative process. As designers, you're able to kind of take the data, you're able to take the brand, and you're able to kind of go, okay, and all those constraints, and say, okay, based on what I'm seeing, what I'm understanding, here's some directions that could answer those things. And you will come up with multiple ways to do that. I think the outcome that you're trying to achieve, if that is differentiation, I think will come from conversation with your partners. You will go, hey, what if we tried this? Here's an interesting thing. We're going to put an owl and it's going to be up front. It's like, okay, well, let's question that together. Don't get too hung up on the fact that, oh, this is really fun. It's like, okay, that's great that it's fun. That's great that it's a kind of branding moment, but let's make sure that it is relevant, and let's have those conversations. I mean, again, you can test stuff as you go. You don't have to kind of do a final design and go, okay, I've figured it out. Like, how can you kind of gauge with markets and audiences early on in your process as well? There was a process that we would use occasionally at Headspace, which was called this kind of demand test. Can you just put something out as a kind of front door or an email or a notification, say, hey, we're doing this thing. Would you be interested? Is that something that would be interesting to you? You can give them a kind of idea. It doesn't have to be a fully formed product yet, but would people be interested in this thing? Do they resonate with it? And if they did, then that gave you the kind of like almost green light with your audience, say, okay, we should be exploring this further. You would also potentially get feedback and say, hey, this is interesting, but I don't like these things about it. This is not resonating. Or you would get no response and you go, okay, well, this doesn't work then. Let's not progress with this. And in that way, you're not too concerned about the kind of final metrics, like did it perform well, but you have a data source, you have feedback. So it's like being able to kind of prototype things early on, play around with them, get feedback, very lightweight. It doesn't have to be setting up full on user testing, and there's different ways of doing that. But again, making sure that, you're as a creative are exploring and you have license to explore, but you're still having conversations with your partners, you're having conversations with your end users. And then you shouldn't need to stress, because there's a kind of virtuous cycle in making something, showing it, and getting feedback.
Thank you so much, Iain. So how could we learn to train oneself to explore beyond typical design patterns, and how to deliver that great, fun and interactive product to the end user?
Yeah, I think exploration is an interesting one. Again, constraints. I think of when you're working in kind of product and you have to you have roadmaps, you have, maybe you're working in sprints, maybe you've got 2 weeks. And so I've got 2 weeks, but not only you want to deliver something at the end of that 2 weeks. So how does that give you license to explore? How can you kind of like take a small amount of time and really kind of push it forward? I think the thing is not to think of it in terms of 2 week sprints. It's more of a kind of, okay, how do we kind of explore throughout each sprint? How are we continually exploring? What are we looking for in terms of inspiration? How are we engaging with the whole business and our audiences to understand where the opportunities are? To design beyond the typical design patterns I think those are the reference points. I think there's so many great onboarding that you can look at. There's so many good websites. I think patterns still exist. I used to use that all the time to say, hey, show me 10 great onboarding flows. And they were really similar. Like the kind of the way that you kind of get people into a product. There's literally books on it. There's so many great ways. Apple and Google now actually give you guidelines like, hey, if you're going to onboard someone, do this. So the actual flow that you need to figure out, I think, is already there. I don't think you need to worry about that too much. I think you will have to kind of test based on your context, because to take Spotify's onboarding and put it in your own product, that's not going to work because they have their own objectives in mind. But I think you can learn from those. So I think when you're kind of trying to kind of be creative and bring in those delightful moments, it's like, okay, let's get the fundamentals out of the way. And that's dismissive, but it's like, get the fundamentals done. Now, how do we push on the brand? How do we kind of like, what is the fun moments that we can bring into this? And in some cases, again, Headspace is a great reference. It was about subtle animation. It was about how things that are moving as you're moving through an onboarding flow that is still very standard. It's maybe 4 screens. You have a swipe or a tap to progress. But in doing that, something happens that's maybe unexpected. Something happens that is in keeping with the brand. There's a smile somewhere. There's a pulse. There's an ebb, but it's still there. And you can kind of like notice it. And maybe you don't notice it because quite a lot of people skip onboarding anyway, but it's there if people want to engage with it. And I think it's always about it, if it makes sense. So how you can explore is really clear as well. There's a great documentary on Netflix called Abstract, and I would recommend watching all of them. Some of them are from different walks of design, but one in particular is the Instagram one, and it's from a few years ago now. So this was when Iain Spatler was the head of design or VP of design at Instagram, and he talked about I think it was explore the edges. So how do you just kind of go wild with your ideas and make sure that you've kind of explored all territories, really kind of gone in and push boundaries? And there's some really good examples again in that documentary, and I hold on to that explore the edges from having seen that as a kind of like, yeah, that was something that I felt like I always did and something I always encouraged the teams to do. It's like, okay, your first idea is great, the second idea is okay. Let's see another 10 and go as far out and wide as you can. Be unconstrained as much as you can. And then we'll use constraints to kind of like go, okay, this idea is great. There's an aspect of this thing over here that's also interesting. And what if we combine those things? What if we started to remix and started to kind of like leverage some really fundamental design patterns along with these interesting aspects that maybe we would not have considered had we just followed regular patterns.
Thank you so much, Iain. So how could design leaders and managers shape their team to bring creativity and uniqueness into the product that they are crafting for?
Yeah, and I think this kind of touches a little on diversity of not only the team, but also the kind of the business as a whole. So when you think of technology and product, it has been historically kind of very people who are in tech, people who understand the technology. It's more often not being kind of white males, which I am one. There's kind of like those are the people who've been up front. But increasingly, as we see the kind of like diversity and more people with different skill sets and more backgrounds coming into design and into product, we're now seeing these products and experiences that kind of are informed by their different backgrounds, are informed by what they can bring to the table. And I always try I always don't always succeed in bringing together a kind of diverse team onto projects. Like, how can we not just have another product designer be involved in this? Can we bring someone from, even having branding designers who don't really understand product in the same way that a product designer might, and bring them into the product design process so that they're not just doing these static graphic arts now anymore. They're now thinking about how it can move, how it can be part of that. So bringing in different skill sets, making sure that you are, again, I think it takes me into sort of hiring. Like, how can you hire interesting people into your team that maybe don't have a traditional design background? Some great designers in previous teams, one was a psychologist. They had been working in psychology, but that lent itself really well because they were kind of examining human behavior. They were understanding how that worked and what could inform different behaviors and patterns. And they were just great at kind of like telling stories on behalf of what the user might be thinking at a certain time. At Netflix, I worked with game designers. They're thinking in terms of logic and rules and different ways of like, oh, here's the game loop that we need to build in, almost like a kind of storyteller thinking about the journey that someone will go on and the path they could go down. And I was always seeing that as a great analogy for user, what we might classify as user experience, because they're trying to understand how to take a person through a journey. So always trying to look for different ways of people's whose skills are maybe not quite as kind of straight lined as you would think, and coming at things from different angles, making sure that you're able to kind of like bring in different points of view and different perspectives that don't seem like they would normally fit. It's like, well, actually, that's quite good. Let's give this to someone else to look at who has no understanding or no context and see how they respond. Just generally looking at things differently. I think you need to be able to do that. There's an artist who I follow called Joshua Davis. He would put food coloring into his eyes so that he could see things differently. He'd look at his art differently. So he would literally have this different lens on things. Really, really interesting. And we could help shift his perspective on like, oh, now that everything's red, I can see how this is like different and start to play around with stuff. And he's a great kind of digital generative artist now. And I've been following his work for a long time, but that stuck with me. The fact that it seems a bit, out there to kind of do that, but it was always like, oh, he's just looking at things from a different perspective and coming at things from a different angle. You don't need to go to that extreme necessarily, but I think there's something in that as an approach.
Thank you so much, Iain, for sharing all these wonderful insights with us. So could you please share with us, how does your day look like and any interesting stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, to sort of maybe more touch on, so I'm a design manager. I still am someone who kind of likes to be creative. So I think recently, again, I've just started a new role, so I'm still figuring out the cadence of that. But if I look back to roles at Netflix and Headspace, I think my kind of approach would be to try and kind of make sure that you are connecting with your team, like understanding the team as a manager, as someone who's helping support and enable those people at their level. So it's not, hey, here's resources I'm trying to move around and assign. It's very much, okay, can I connect with this individual? Can I understand their perspectives? It's very much a kind of design exercise in itself, empathy mapping, like what motivates this person, what doesn't motivate them, what, drags them down, like how can I remove those blockers? So a lot of my day would be having those one-on-one conversations, making sure that the teams feel supported, they have the resources they need. Again, part design operations, making sure they are able to kind of do design. How do we make sure that they have the runway, they have the opportunities, they are being inspired by what is happening around them. And if I think of, when we were working at Headspace before we were all, so like 2019, before COVID and everyone was locked in and all those things, what was great about it was exploring that space. We had they still have a really great space in Santa Monica and Los Angeles. And there was always things up on the wall. There was always things that you could kind of walk around the building and be inspired, which was great. And I think the one thing was having that stimulus around, making sure that the teams could see work. When we went online and everyone was digital, that changed. We weren't able to have that same connectivity that wasn't around. And I do miss that. And I'm looking forward to bringing that back to churn out where there will be people in person. But I think this idea that you can kind of like support people, making sure that you are giving them what they need and making sure that you are connecting with them at an individual level and making sure that you're giving those people opportunities to connect. So I'd be looking for, my day-to-day is like, okay, these 3 projects are happening. How do I get this person who's working on this involved in this project over here? How can we get them to connect? So they're kind of understanding each other's things, and those, whether it's design reviews or whether it's just, the team connecting at an individual level. I think the one thing that I try to bring into any team I work with is this kind of weekly ritual of connecting. How do we share the work that we're doing? But more than just sharing the work in that process, how do we share who we are and what interests us and what motivates us? Can we do these little presentations about ourselves and take 10 minutes to discuss that and go, oh, I never knew that about you. That gives me a new perspective. That gives me a new understanding. And having seen people come into certain design review sessions and take time to talk about skateboarding, or take time to talk about the music they create, or take time to show their photography and just explore that other side of them, was really, I think it's been really powerful for those teams to feel connected. But it's also bringing in those kind of like new inputs, like, oh, it's like, someone referring like a good movie or a magazine that you might want to kind of watch or read, or a good book. It's like, you wouldn't have got that had you not had that conversation. If you're just focused on the work, you would just get the work done, and you wouldn't, that's it. Come in and do the work done. Follow the patterns. It looks like every other product done. So how do you kind of bring in stimulus? How do you bring in inspiration from all over and get those people to connect and collaborate? That's my job, I feel like, is to do that.
Thank you so much, Iain. Thank you, Iain, for sharing all these wonderful insights with us. So we'll conclude the show by you recommending 3 favorite books of yours and also people who inspire you the most in this space.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. I mean, I'll give you 2 that I've read and one that I'm currently reading in terms of books, and I put it on there because I'm already, I think, halfway through, and it's great. So, the first book, or maybe the series of books, is "Steal Like an Artist" by Austin Kleon. He's a great artist. He writes very much around these the idea. It's like, if you take the title literally, it's not stealing and repurposing for yourself. But it's understanding that you can be inspired by so many things around the world around you, and how do you pull on those things? How do you pull on that to kind of inform your work? Yeah, he has a great blog. He has a great Instagram and Twitter account, but his books are really good. I've listened to them. I'm actually going to go out and buy them physically now because I think it's definitely worth doing that. The second one is Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. So this is the kind of the Pixar story, how it came together, how it came to be, how Steve Jobs influenced that, how that creative team kind of evolved from a very small kind of set of almost like engineers to kind of like a creative storytelling powerhouse. And also how they failed. I think there was lots of failure in that. For anyone that's read the book, they might know the Toy Story 2 story where everything got lost, and it's like, wow, how did they come back from that? And their idea of this brain trust. A really great book, really great read. And then the one that I'm reading right now, which I'm really excited about getting through, is Emotion by Design. So this is Greg Hoffman. He used to be the marketing at Nike, and he talks a lot about how he kind of came into Nike and what he did, and talks a lot about creativity, and talks a lot about being a team sport. And there's a line that really resonated with me, and I might even see if I've got it in front of me, but it talks about, curiosity is the catalyst for creativity. It allows you to see opportunities and harness the inspiration to seize them. Finding inspiration can be difficult, despite how infinite it is. So rather than waiting for it to find you, create a plan that allows it to flow naturally through you and into your work. So that's like, wow, that's like exactly where I would aspire to do with a team, is like, how do you find those moments for creativity? How can you bring it in so that it doesn't feel like we need to be creative at this point, so let's be creative now. It's like, how is that constantly happening? And I think curiosity, so that being open and understanding and seeing things differently is key. So that book is really resonating with me right now. So I definitely recommend it. As far as the people I could have followed and I'm inspired by, I mentioned him earlier, but Iain Spatler, again, I watched that documentary a few times now, and I really enjoy it. But I think his perspective on things, like, he was at Instagram, but he also worked on the Nike Fuel Band. You'll see from the documentary, just as a really kind of interesting take on the world. Julie Zhu, so she was the head of design at Facebook. I think she was an engineer when she started. She came into Facebook really early, and just her transformation, just the kind of like the way that she wrote and was kind of exposing herself and kind of getting feedback, I think was really inspiring. I think that her book as well, as making a manager or becoming a manager, is a great text. I've given that to managers that I've said, hey, I could tell you how to do stuff, but Julie can do it way better than I can. Read this book. So Julie's great. And then Kirby Ferguson. So he did this documentary series called Everything is a Remix. Fantastic. It was, I feel like it's maybe a decade ago that he did the original one, and he's kind of come back to it constantly and revisiting different tropes and different things around this idea that nothing is new, nothing is original. They're all remixes of different ideas combined together, and the documentary is just really well done. I think it was a Kickstarter. I fell in love with it as soon as it arrived, and I anticipate his changes and updates to all the time. But I think he's really smart. The way that he frames stuff, he's a really good storyteller, and I love his work a lot.
Thank you so much, Iain, for sharing all these wonderful insights with us. We're looking forward to host you again in our upcoming episodes. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.